Number 10. Bristol Beaufighter. On March 17, 1943, a Bristol Beaufighter with the Royal Air Force suffered engine problems and went crashing down into the sea. The pilot and the observer were lucky enough to survive, but unfortunately, the two-seater heavy fighter was lost. The wartime aircraft built by the Bristol Aeroplane Company sank to the bottom of the ocean. It's actually still sitting on the sandy seabed today at a depth of around 120 feet, just shy of 3,000 feet from the city of St. Julian's Point in Malta. Most of the plane has been buried in sand by now, but some parts are still visible to divers brave enough to visit the site. The wings and the main fuselage are still intact, the tires are sticking out from behind the radial engines, and the side propeller still looks as though it could spin. And to make this place even more interesting, there are plenty of other wrecks here. The floor of the ocean off the coast of Malta is a whole graveyard of warplanes, from the Bristol Blenheim bomber to the Lockheed P-2V Neptune. It's a haunting reminder of the tragedies of war and the heavy military vessels soldiers once controlled. Number 9. Churchill's Abandoned War Room. Underneath the streets of Westminster in England, the abandoned war room used by Churchill still sits 10 feet below solid ground. It's located in the basement of the Treasury Building, originally established in 1938. It was a secret underground meeting space for the main players in the British war effort. One of these people was Winston Churchill, who spent the majority of his time in and out of the secret war room plotting and scheming. The facility once included dormitories for the staff, private bedrooms for the senior ministers, and a main bedroom for Churchill himself. He used his room to work, to host meetings, and to take his much-needed daily naps. He even had a microphone on his desk linked directly to the broadcasting room at the BBC. From his underground bunker, he made 4 very important speeches during the war. Much of his stuff is still down there today, although the entire base is abandoned and full of cobwebs. His famous chair in the meeting room is still there, still marked from where Churchill ground his nails on its arms during tense moments. Number 8. Hangar 4. About 100 miles from Calgary in the Canadian province of Alberta, there's an abandoned airfield from the Second World War. There were originally 7 hangars built at Claresholm, but only one remains even remotely intact today. It's Hangar 4, and it's seen better days. Not much of its white paint remains. 80 years of harsh wind has sandblasted the hangar into an empty shell. The windows are shattered, and the only life forms here these days are the pigeons. The derelict building is surrounded by a metal fence of twisted barbed wire and old signs warning people not to enter. Back in 1943, there were over 100 air training fields across Canada. It was part of a major program to train air crews fighting in the war. This particular training base churned out pilots and airfield technicians. But when the war was over, Canada ceased being a major supplier of pilots, switching to a more peaceful and less militaristic stance on the world stage. Almost all the major air bases across the country were abandoned, including this one. Number 7. KINROSS Auxiliary Airfield. The KINROSS Auxiliary Airfield was built back in 1943 in Michigan. It was a small airfield with 3 runways and a small parking area. It was mostly used to refuel military aircraft on their way from elsewhere in America to Alaska. When the war was finally over, the airfield was used as a hub for private and commercial pilots. It became the official airport for the town of Sault Ste. Maria in 1945. But after 7 years of commercial service, the airfield was largely abandoned in 1952. There was one interesting thing that happened here. On November 23, 1953, the Air Force scrambled a jet from the airfield at Kinross to investigate a UFO flying in restricted airspace over Lake Superior. The jet pursued this object for 30 minutes at a whopping speed of 500 miles per hour. However, the object eventually disappeared and left no trace of itself behind. But the pilot who was chasing the UFO also vanished, First Lieutenant Felix Moncla. Neither Felix nor his plane, nor Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson, who had been working the radar, have ever been found. What do you think happened on that November day in 1953? How did a fighter jet with the American Air Force vanish without a trace, never to be found again? Remember, this didn't happen in some foreign country, it was in Michigan, and yet the plane has never been found. Let us know your thoughts on this bizarre case in the comments section down below, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of this video. Number 6. Abandoned Barracks. There's an eerie abandoned barracks from World War II hiding in England's Northamptonshire. It was first built almost a century ago in 1925, but today it just looks like the wreckage of some forsaken barn. It was originally called the BRISTOL camp, used as an immigration camp for Canadians when it was first established in the 1920s. It was sold to the War Office in 1939 and repurposed into an army camp. But when the war ended in 1945, it ended up being taken over by the U.S. Army. The Army stuck around for a little while, but eventually left and the site went unoccupied. A company called Stewart's and Lloyd's Steelworks purchased the property at an auction. Over 100 people from Scotland moved in to work at the steel plant, but it fell apart in just a few years. Since the end of the 1960s, it's remained mostly empty. It was used briefly as a chicken farm, as a truck parking lot, and that's about it. Looking at it today, you'd never even know it was once home to thousands of soldiers preparing for war. Number 5. Veterans Shadow Box. A man named Gene Stefik was given a shadow box. The shadow box was discovered in an abandoned storage locker in Elkhart, Indiana. Gene didn't really know what to do with the box, which was filled with a World War II veteran's lost belongings, so he gave it to his brother. Luckily, his brother works with the Veterans Association, and so Gene was hoping he could track down the owner. Inside this mysterious box was a folded flag, campaign medals from both Germany and Africa, a Bible, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart, and some obituaries. Gene's brother was able to track down the veteran and his son, but both turned out to be deceased. He finally found his daughter still alive in West Virginia. He contacted the daughter, who couldn't believe her father's military awards had been found, and in an abandoned storage locker several states away of all places. Arrangements were made and Gene's brother drove all the way there to safely deliver the box personally to the veteran's next of kin. It took 7 hours, but it was well worth it to reunite the family with priceless military awards. Plus, the personal mementos of a fallen hero that could never have been replaced can now be passed on to future generations of the family. Number 4. Estonian Tank in the Mud. In Estonia, a young boy found an abandoned tank from World War II stuck in the mud. The vehicle had been stuck in the slime at the edge of what was once a lake since 1944, a Soviet T-34-76 tank. It was while the boy was exploring the woods near his home that he uncovered tank tracks leading into the shallow water. Curious, he started digging. That was when he found the armor of the tank's hull under a few feet of muck. He went back to his village and got help from the adults, who together managed to tow the thing out of the swamp and back onto dry land. The tank was in such amazing condition, it looked as though they could have turned the key and drove away in it. But of course it wasn't functional. It had been in the mud for 56 years at the time of its discovery in 2000. It was likely a casualty of fighting that occurred from February to September of 1944. In the northeastern part of Estonia, over 100,000 men were killed during combat between the Soviet Army and the German Army. The Germans must have captured this tank during the fighting. Then, when they retreated on September 19, 1944, the tank got left behind. The Germans probably pushed it into the lake to keep the Soviets from getting their hands on it. If you found tank tracks, would you follow them and dig to see what you'd find? Let us know how adventurous you are in the comments down below. Number 3. Abandoned Village. 80 years before today, the humble residents of a small English village called Imber were pushed out of their homes. It was the military who forced them out so they could use their village for combat training. The village was also very close to shell impact areas, and it would have become inhospitable anyway. The military took over the village, and when the war was over, they kept it. All these years later, the Ministry of Defense still owns the village, meaning the locals never got to see their houses again. It's been used periodically as a training site, but is mostly just left alone. The village is still in the exact same shape it was in the early days of the war. The only difference is that shells and explosions have ripped apart many of the main structures. The only thing modern is a military building constructed for training purposes in the 1960s. But these days, the military doesn't do any kind of training exercises. They refuse to give the village back, preferring it to sit abandoned. Number 2. Airbase for sale. Camp Picton opened in the year 1940 as a training school for pilots. Today, the abandoned training school in Prince Edward County, just 2 hours from Toronto, is 700 acres of prime land on the market for $15 million. Through the 1940s, it was used as an airbase. The Canadian training school was involved in the Commonwealth Air Training Program. The school hosted pilots from New Zealand, the United States, Australia, and even the UK. 6 pilots actually died here during training and were buried at a nearby cemetery. Up to 800 troops took courses at the base at one time, with many of the soldiers from places like Australia miserable in the Canadian winters. Many of the initiates thought they had been brought to hell because it was so cold and snowy. By 1948, the base had become a gunnery school, but by 1960, there wasn't much need for it anymore. The base was closed, the local economy suffered, and the property was sold to the mayor of Picton. It's since been used as a movie set, to store props, and it was even featured in Canada's Worst Driver. But it remains abandoned to this day, and now it's up for sale for anyone who wants to live inside the ruined shell of an old air training school. Number 1. Abandoned Royal Air Force Base. In North Yorkshire, there's a Royal Air Force base that played a crucial role in defeating the Nazis back in World War II. It's completely abandoned now, having been left to rot for decades. But when it was built in 1937, it was a sight to behold. When war was announced 2 years later, fearless pilots used the base as their hub for operations while defending England's biggest cities against German bombing raids. Some of the first night fighters, pilots operating in near total blackness under the cover of night, set off from this very airbase. It was also home to the RAF Eagle Squadron, composed of American volunteers. It hosted the 1st Canadian RAF Squadron and the 1st Polish RAF Squadron. It was a multicultural nexus of air defense. But after the war was over, maintenance ceased. The station was used for a little while for pilot training, then completely left to the elements in the 1960s. Would you buy an abandoned World War II airbase if you had the cash? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks so much for watching today's video. For more great videos on history, be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for another amazing video right here on American Eye.